Right, halfway. So when we started to research this tour, which was to look at extraction in agriculture, we discounted a few things first, which were maybe more obvious. First one was the way in which plants themselves could be argued to be extracting energy from the sun as it dissipates, and sort of but we decided to take a bit of less obvious route and look at chemistry and the role that extraction plays in agricultural chemistry, because the sun and the rain that fall onto the land and make plants grow aren't really limited in any way. So you could argue that there's no extraction happening there. Instead of just diverting things temporarily and then they go back into the matrix.
Okay, so the story of NPK is the story of nitrogen, phosphate, and potassium in agriculture. We identified these three essential plant nutrients as a kind of set of materials that connect agriculture and agricultural problems throughout history. So one of the first things is, we're here on the bus with a barrel. Justus von Liebig is known as the father of agricultural chemistry. He was a 19th century German chemist, and he came up with this concept of the law of minima. And just incredibly briefly, the staves of the barrel in this concept represent all of the nutrients essential to plant growth. So if you remove a part of one of the bits of the barrel, you reduce the plant's potential for growth. So if you have nitrogen, phosphate, or potassium in whatever quantity, the plant will grow to the least quantity available. So that's the law of minima, which is essential to agriculture of all eras. And it's where you source these these nutrients that is what we're focusing on in our tour.
Okay, so moving on to our first. So we gave a little talk in the bus before we left the car park, and this was our first stop, which was at Lanyon Quoit, and we completely ignored the Quoit.
Potentially controversial.
Yeah. So I've got a little quote here from Metals and Micronutrients Uptake and Utilisation by Plants by D.A. Robb and W.S. Pierpoint. Green plants are the miners of the Earth's crust, being the major selective accumulators of inorganic nutrients upon which other life forms are directly or indirectly dependent. So we went to the site and we dug up a piece of soil and we looked at the way in which plants in a sort of pre-farming landscape dynamically accumulate nutrients from decaying rock by bringing them up through their roots. And some of these plants will go down, the roots go down 15 meters to get to the rock, and they'll be bringing up the potassium and the phosphorus. And also nitrogen-fixing plants sucking nitrogen out of the air and fixing that and building up a layer of soil over 10,000 years. So plants as miners of the Earth's crust. Right. So we produced a series of diagrams to try and get across the main concept. So really quickly, there's the sun up here. Everything is a continuum. So there's the sun, there's atmospheric nitrogen. This is bound solar excess, which is energy from the sun that's bound it's been stratified in the Carboniferous period. So coal, oil, and gas. This is stratified phosphate and stratified potassium, also in the lithosphere, in the crust of the Earth. In early farming, from Bronze Age to medieval, basically, the plants are dynamically accumulating those nutrients, being fed through a cow, which then, straight through a cow, then comes up and onto the crop, which you're trying to grow, in this case a cereal crop. And during that period, people were augmenting the fertility by collecting seaweed and seashells off of beaches to bring these elements down here into the system in more concentration. So they were sort of extracting materials from the beaches which have been accumulated by biotic action by other organisms. And I'm going to introduce it.
From on the north coast near Zenner, from Rozmergy to Besigren, for those familiar with the area, there's one of Europe's best examples of field systems from the Bronze Age period. We met up with landscape historian David Giddings, and he helped us identify and read the landscape to be able to try to imagine what was happening during those periods. So there's the group talking about Bronze Age agriculture. There are also really good examples of medieval strip field systems. So,
okay, and then when we left that, we were there for 2 hours at that location, and we had lots of fun looking at bumps and lumps in the landscape with David, and he was kind of leading for us. And then on the bus towards the next location, we very briefly covered the whole proto-industrial period in agriculture, which is, and the changes here are, you've still got the solar excess feeding everything by sunlight, still got atmospheric nitrogen being fixed by the sward, with the grasses on the moorland, being fed through the cow onto the crop. But the extra thing here is guano, which was mined extensively from the coast of Chile. Takes 10,000 years to build up into layers to the point where you can mine it, and this was discovered in
1823.
1823. She's superb. And so this is like the first proper example of extraction in agriculture of a resource that you can't put back once it's taken out, because you take it out, use it for basically the period that guano was used in agriculture stretched for about 100 years, and 10,000 years worth of build-up was used up.
So we went from lovely green field systems to, after lunch, we went to Varfell Farm, which is just outside of Penzance, and it's a large-scale commercial flower farm. And it's they have 900 hectares, and they are the largest daffodil supplier in Europe. So we had a tour by the farm manager, Arthur Andrews, who very kindly showed the group around. There's actually no activity there at the moment because the season has been so weird this year. They should be packing bulbs, but they're kind of anticipating whenever that might happen. So they were kind of preparing the facilities for that when we were there.
So they produce 160 million bunches of daffodils a year, and they go all over the world. And he was quite proud of his statistics and the fact that they would pick daffodils one morning and the next morning they'd be in Boston.
There we are exiting one of the cold stores for the daffodils. You can see the level of distribution for all the different Tescos. There's the boxes that the bulbs go into. And agrochemicals.
Yeah. Okay, so this brings us on to, basically we have this kind of like Robin Mackay, who's with us, describes this transition from being on the north coast of Zenner in all the Bronze Age and Romano-British and medieval field systems into this kind of concrete landscape with these huge sheds as this future shock. It really was quite incredible, and we then basically gave us the opportunity to look at what happens now in agriculture. So, do you want to say something?
Yeah, and it's just the kind of the agrochemicals, well, you'll see here, it's the kind of build-up of the process. So we've gone from guano, and the process is just like, it's ratcheting. So the more people you get, the more ways that you have to find to source these three elements to feed people and to nourish plants. And so as the population expands, it has this ratcheting effect. So now you end up at the point of, the beginning of World War I, where they're actually having the sources of nitrates for the world's food is becoming a really big issue. And as we'll see, can you describe?
Yeah, so all of the phosphates being mined, potassium being mined, which we'll see in a second, going straight in to the agriculture system. There's no reliance really on rotational systems, which we saw in the tour before when we were at the cliffs in Zena. So this model of agriculture is really, you can't really see it here in Cornwall. This is more like the American Midwest, where all of our food does actually come from in reality, and from Brazil, etc. So the stratified solar excess from the Carboniferous period is now being pumped into a processing plant which is producing artificially fixed or synthetically fixed nitrogen. Nitrogen, I have to make a real quick point about nitrogen. Nitrogen was like, in our image of Liebig's barrel, nitrogen was the hardest sort of thing to fix that stave and to get over this problem of minima in agriculture. Nitrogen is an element that really wants to be a gas. It's really hard to fix it and to get it to stay in the soil. Plants only do it through a symbiotic relationship with bacteria, and the only other way that it fixes in nature is by lightning strike, which has the power to kind of to make the atomic shift. So Haber-Bosch in 1910 he came up with the process of splitting the bond from nitrogen goes around in pairs. So he came up with the process of splitting the bond between the two nitrogen atoms and getting them to stick to hydrogen, making ammonia, or synthetic ammonia. And so the hydrogen is coming from the stratified bound solar excess in the form of natural gas. Also here, coming into the machinery, the mechanization of agriculture, diesel, etc. Anything else? So we then had the opportunity to do a little mini lecture as the conclusion of our tour, and for this we were kindly offered the facilities at Varfell Farm, and this is their training room where they train all of the mainly Eastern European workers in health and safety and how to put an elastic band around a bunch of daffodils. So it was suitably claustrophobic and quite horrible. And here we just very quickly looked at the effects of extraction in agriculture to produce those minerals NPK as we are now. So this is the remains of a phosphate mine on an island called Nauru, which is in the South Pacific, and this island basically was completely mined out to produce phosphate for the Australian grain boom. This is a phosphate mine in the Kola Peninsula in Russia. So phosphate in this form is actually coming from the stratified and fossilized remains of crustacea from the Cambrian explosion. So it's like 500 million years ago. So once this stuff's all mined out and put out into the fields, you've got to wait another 500 million years to get it to the same level again, which probably, obviously, is not going to happen because the same geological and atmospheric contingencies. You know, who could say that that would be the same ever again? And we're not going to be around in 500 million years to find out, I'm sure. This is phosphate extraction in Florida.
This is potassium extraction in Germany. Potassium is, it's normally in the salt form. It exists in salt water, and this is basically large inland dried out seas. So it's layered salt and potassium. So they discovered it, they were salt mining, and they dug deeper in about 1857, and they found something new. And within 5 years, they'd identified it as a really good agricultural fertilizer, and it's been mined intensively, mainly now in Canada, Germany, China, and a few other places.
Mm-hmm. So phosphate and potassium are basically mined only for the agricultural industry. The agricultural industry uses about 95% of what's extracted, and the figures are pretty huge. Got them to hand. So, with phosphate, at the moment, world usage is like 170 million tonnes of phosphate every year. Potassium, 27 million tonnes, and fixed nitrogen, about 180 million tonnes.
That's a giant pile of salt having been taken out of the potassium mines.
That's the waste heap. And this is a Haber-Bosch plant. This one's in China, but they're all over the world. Every country's got their own methodologies and plants for synthetically fixing nitrogen. So to conclude, the extraction of any one of those minerals, if you put it into a productivity curve, it would completely correlate with this. It would just fit over for potassium, phosphate or nitrogen. The curve is exactly the same. So there we go. Extraction in agriculture.